They laughed first. That is how it always begins. Not the loud kind of laughter that fills a room, but the quiet, dismissive kind, the kind that happens behind your back, in sideways glances, in the unspoken agreement that you were not worth taking seriously. They laughed at your patience, mistaking it for weakness. They laughed at your silence, assuming it meant defeat. They laughed at your faith, your restraint, your refusal to strike back when you had every reason to do so. In their minds, the story was already written, and you were destined to play the small, forgettable role. What they never understood is that laughter reveals more about the one laughing than the one being laughed at. It exposes a confidence built on sand, a certainty borrowed from the moment rather than rooted in truth. They believed power was noise, that victory announced itself early, that those who were winning always looked like they were winning. They did not know that some battles are decided long before they are visible, and that silence is often the sound of preparation, not surrender. You carried the weight quietly. While they congratulated themselves, you learned endurance. While they mocked your slowness, you were learning depth. Every wound they caused sharpened your awareness, refined your character, and stripped away illusions that might have ruined you later. They thought they were watching you fall, not realizing they were witnessing the slow construction of something unbreakable. They mistook delay for denial, not knowing that some things ripen in darkness. There is a peculiar blindness that comes with arrogance. It convinces a person that the present moment is permanent. They assumed your situation defined you. They assumed your struggles were proof of your limits. They assumed that because you were quiet, nothing was happening. They never asked what kind of strength grows in a soul that has learned to wait without becoming bitter, to suffer without becoming cruel, to hope without applause. Time, however, is an honest judge. It does not rush to defend anyone, nor does it forget. It reveals the difference between borrowed confidence and earned resilience. As days passed, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but steadily. You began to stand differently, speak differently, see differently. The same eyes that once looked down on you now struggled to understand you, because you no longer fit the story they told themselves. What unsettled them most was not your success, but your peace. You did not return their laughter with mockery. You did not seek revenge. You did not demand recognition. You simply moved forward, carrying with you a calm that could not be explained by circumstances alone. And that calm spoke louder than any argument ever could. It suggested that you had found a truth they still feared to face. They laughed first, yes, but laughter has a way of fading when it is built on false assumptions. It falters when the person it once targeted no longer needs approval. It weakens when the one who was underestimated becomes undeniable. The moment they realized this, the laughter changed. It lost its ease. It became forced, brittle, uncertain. Because deep down, they knew something had slipped from their control. You got the last laugh not because you planned it, but because you endured. Not because you proved them wrong with words, but because life itself answered on your behalf. Your growth was the reply, your steadiness was the verdict, your quiet joy was the conclusion they never saw coming. And in that moment, without noise, without cruelty, without triumphal boasting, the truth stood clear. The story did not end where they thought it would, and you were never as small as they needed you to be. They underestimated you because they mistook silence for weakness, and this misunderstanding shaped everything that followed. In a world trained to equate noise with power, stillness is often misread as surrender. When you chose not to argue, not to defend yourself endlessly, not to explain your intentions to people who were committed to misunderstanding you, they assumed you had nothing to say. They believed that if you truly possessed strength, you would announce it loudly, prove it immediately, and demand recognition. Your restraint confused them, and confusion quickly turned into dismissal. Silence unsettles people who rely on dominance through reaction. They expected resistance because resistance confirms their importance. When none came, they filled the gap with assumptions. They decided your quiet meant fear, that your patience meant hesitation, that your composure meant defeat. What they failed to see was that silence can be a discipline, a conscious refusal to waste energy on what does not deserve it. You were not holding your tongue because you were powerless. You were holding it because you understood the cost of speaking without purpose. There is a certain kind of strength that does not announce itself early. It grows inward before it ever shows outward. While they were measuring worth by volume, you were measuring it by substance. You understood that reacting to every insult would keep you trapped at their level, bound to their approval or disapproval. So you chose quiet, not as an escape, but as a boundary. And boundaries often look like weakness to those who benefit from your openness. They never considered that silence could be strategic, that it could be the pause before clarity, the space where discernment forms. They did not realize that some people grow strongest when they stop explaining themselves to those who have already decided the outcome. Your quiet was not emptiness, it was concentration. It was attention redirected inward, where resilience is built and identity is clarified. While they were busy talking about you, you were becoming someone who no longer needed to be talked about. Silence also revealed their impatience. They wanted immediate answers, immediate proof, immediate results. When none appeared, they concluded you had failed. But real transformation rarely rushes. It takes time to unlearn habits of survival, to shed the need for constant validation, to develop a strength that does not depend on applause. You were learning how to stand without leaning on reaction, how to exist without constant defense. That kind of strength does not shout because it does not need to. What they underestimated most was the inner work happening beneath the surface. Silence gave you room to observe rather than react, to understand rather than assume. You began to see patterns, motives, and truths that noise would have drowned out. Their mockery became information. Their dismissal became confirmation that you were no longer playing the same game. Each moment you chose quiet over chaos. You reclaimed a piece of yourself they could no longer touch. In time, your silence changed its meaning. What once looked like weakness began to feel like weight. People sensed it before they understood it. Your presence carried something different, an unspoken certainty, a grounded calm that did not seek permission. The same silence they mocked became the silence they could not penetrate, because by then it was no longer absence. It was authority formed without words, strength shaped without display, and power that no longer needed to explain itself. Their laughter was not confidence but insecurity, though it wore the costume of certainty so convincingly that even they believed it. People who are truly secure rarely feel the urge to mock. They do not need an audience for their assurance, nor do they require someone beneath them to feel above themselves. But insecurity is noisy. It laughs too quickly, too sharply, as if volume could replace truth. When they laughed at you, it was not because they were certain of their superiority. It was because your presence unsettled something unresolved within them. Mockery is often a defense, not an attack. It is the shield people raise when they sense a threat they cannot yet name. Your restraint, your steadiness, your refusal to perform according to their expectations disturbed their inner balance. You did not mirror their chaos. you did not rush to prove yourself. And that silence became a mirror they did not want to look into. Rather than confront what they saw there, doubt, fear, inadequacy, they turned outward and laughed, hoping sound would drown out reflection. They laughed because they could not control you. Control thrives on predictability, on reactions that can be provoked and managed. You offered neither. Your calm denied them leverage, and so they reduced you in words, believing that diminishing you would restore their sense of power. In reality, it only exposed how fragile that power was. Confident people do not need to belittle. Insecure people cannot resist it. There is something deeply revealing about what a person chooses to mock. They mock discipline because it highlights their lack of it. They mock patience because it reminds them of their impulsiveness. They mock faith, restraint, and depth because these qualities require inner work they have avoided. Your existence became an uncomfortable reminder that another way of being was possible, and rather than aspire to it, they laughed at it. Their insecurity depended on consensus. Laughter works best in groups because it borrows courage from numbers. Alone, many of them would not have dared to say what they said. Together, they felt justified. Shared mockery gave them a false sense of unity, a temporary bond formed not by growth but by exclusion. You were the unspoken price of their belonging, and yet, even then, the laughter carried an edge, because deep down, they knew it was borrowed confidence, not earned conviction. What they did not realize was that insecurity is exhausting. It requires constant reinforcement. Each laugh had to be repeated, each judgment renewed, because it never fully settled the unease beneath it. Meanwhile, you were doing the opposite. You were learning to be at ease without validation, to stand without applause. The less you reacted, the more obvious the imbalance became. Their laughter grew louder because their certainty was thinning. Over time, something shifted. Their jokes began to sound forced. Their confidence required explanation. They watched more closely, not to support you, but to reassure themselves that their earlier judgment still held. And that is when insecurity reveals its final weakness. It cannot tolerate growth in others. The moment you began to rise quietly, without bitterness, without spectacle, their laughter lost its footing. In the end, what exposed them was not confrontation, but contrast. Your steadiness against their mockery, your peace against their noise, your progress against their need to comment. The laughter that once felt sharp now sounded hollow, because it was never rooted in strength. It was only a cover for fear, a fear that you were becoming something they could no longer reduce, explain away, or laugh into silence. While they were busy judging appearances, you were building endurance, character, and inner clarity, things that cannot be measured in moments or displayed on command. They looked only at what was visible, your position, your pace, your silence, your lack of immediate triumph. From that narrow view, they formed conclusions. They assumed that what they saw was all there was, but growth that lasts rarely announces itself. It works quietly, shaping the inside long before it changes the outside. They judged from a distance, without understanding the cost of becoming whole. Appearances are easy to comment on because they demand no responsibility. Anyone can point at the surface and declare an opinion. But endurance is built where no one is watching, in repeated moments of choosing to continue when stopping would be easier. While they measured success by speed, you were learning stamina. While they admired shortcuts, you were learning how to walk a long road without losing yourself. Character is not formed in comfort, and clarity is not born in applause. You were being shaped by pressure, by disappointment, by unanswered questions that forced you to look inward. Each time you resisted the urge to become bitter, something solid formed within you. Each time you refused to compromise your values just to fit their expectations, your sense of self became clearer. They mistook your struggle for stagnation, never realizing that struggle can be the very ground where strength takes root. They saw hesitation where there was reflection. They saw slowness where there was discernment. They saw withdrawal where there was refinement. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. Inside, however, you were shedding illusions about people, about approval, about what truly matters. You were learning what you could control, and just as importantly, what you could release. That kind of clarity changes the way a person stands in the world. Endurance taught you patience, but not the passive kind. It was an active patience, one that chooses consistency over drama. You learned how to continue without constant reassurance, how to keep going without knowing exactly when things would change. That ability to move forward without guarantees is something they never had to develop. And because they never developed it, they could not recognize it in you. Character grew in the spaces where you were tested privately, when no one clapped, when no one defended you, when misunderstanding followed you like a shadow. In those moments, you decided who you would become. You learned restraint instead of retaliation, integrity instead of performance, strength instead of show. Those choices did not make you impressive in their eyes, but they made you stable in ways that cannot be easily shaken. Clarity also brought a quiet separation. As you understood yourself better, you stopped needing to be understood by everyone else. Their opinions lost weight, their judgments lost urgency. You no longer shaped your actions around how they might interpret them. That freedom was subtle, but it was transformative. You began to move with intention rather than reaction, and intention has a way of changing outcomes over time. What they failed to grasp is that people who focus only on appearances often remain trapped by them. They must keep up the image, maintain the narrative, protect the role they play. You were doing the opposite. You were becoming real. And reality, once formed, does not need constant defense. When the moment finally came for your growth to show, it did not look flashy. It looked grounded. It looked inevitable. By then, their early judgments no longer mattered, because endurance had given you staying power, character had given you credibility, and clarity had given you direction. You were no longer trying to be seen, you were simply moving forward, carrying within you a strength that could not be dismissed by surface-level observation. Pain was not wasted, every wound refined you instead of destroying you. What they intended as harm became material for your growth, though at the time it did not feel noble or purposeful. Pain rarely announces its usefulness while it is happening. It arrives heavy, confusing, often unjust, and it tempts you to believe that something has gone wrong beyond repair. They assumed the damage they caused would weaken you permanently. They believed hurt would shrink you, slow you, or harden you into something small and resentful. What they did not understand is that pain, when faced honestly, has a way of carving depth into the soul. Each wound forced a reckoning. You had to confront questions you might otherwise have avoided: who you were without approval, what truly mattered when comfort disappeared, how much of your identity depended on circumstances rather than conviction. Pain stripped away illusions gently at first, then mercilessly. It exposed fragile attachments, false hopes, and expectations that could never sustain you. Though it hurt to lose them, losing them made room for something sturdier to grow. They thought pain would break your spirit. Instead, it trained it. You learned how to sit with discomfort without fleeing into distraction or denial. You learned how to endure emotions that could not be fixed quickly. That endurance quietly expanded your inner capacity. What once overwhelmed you no longer did. What once felt unbearable became survivable. And what is survivable over time becomes instructive. Pain refined your perception. You became more attentive, more discerning, less naive. You noticed subtleties others ignored, the tone beneath words, the intent beneath gestures, the difference between concern and control. This awareness was not cynicism, it was wisdom purchased at a cost. You stopped taking things at face value and started listening for truth beneath appearances. That clarity protected you in ways strength alone never could. There was also a softening that came with the refining. Pain taught you compassion, not the shallow kind that speaks easily, but the deep kind that understands silence. You became less eager to judge, less quick to dismiss struggles that did not look like your own. Having known what it means to carry weight unseen, you learned how to respect what you could not immediately understand in others. This did not make you weaker. It made you more human, more grounded, more real. They expected bitterness. Bitterness would have confirmed their power over you, but pain, when you refused to let it rot inside you, did something else. It clarified your values. You became selective about what you gave your energy to, who you trusted, and what battles were worth fighting. Pain taught you boundaries without cruelty, strength without arrogance. It showed you where you ended and where others began. Refinement is rarely gentle. It is repetitive, uncomfortable, and often lonely. There were moments when you questioned whether enduring was worth it, whether holding on to integrity was costing you too much. Yet each time you chose not to collapse inward, something in you aligned more firmly. You were being shaped, not punished. Even when you could not name it, something was taking form. Over time, the wounds closed, not always without scars, but scars are not signs of defeat. They are evidence of survival and adaptation. Where there was once raw pain, there was now understanding. Where there was confusion, there was perspective. You did not forget what happened, but you were no longer defined by it. The pain no longer dictated your reactions or your future. What they never anticipated was that refinement changes how a person stands in the world. You carried yourself differently, spoke with more intention, and moved with a quiet certainty that could not be taught. The very experiences meant to undo you had sharpened you. Pain had passed through you without hollowing you out. It left you denser, steadier, and harder to shake. In the end, the wounds did not make you smaller. They made you precise. They removed what was unnecessary and strengthened what remained. Pain was not wasted, it was transformed. And what emerges from that kind of refinement is not fragile. It is composed, resilient, and prepared in ways that no easy path could ever produce. Delay was never denial. Your growth was happening in places their eyes could not reach. They assumed that because nothing visible was changing, nothing meaningful was occurring. In their thinking, value had to be immediate and progress had to be obvious. If results did not appear quickly, they concluded the effort was wasted. But some forms of becoming do not hurry, and some foundations must be laid where no applause can interrupt the work. What they called delay was often protection. Time gave you distance from impulses that would have damaged you if rewarded too soon. It allowed your motives to be tested, your patience to be stretched, and your understanding to deepen. Had the doors opened earlier, you might have stepped through them unprepared, carrying unresolved fear or fragile confidence. What looked like waiting was, in truth, preparation taking its time. Growth beneath the surface is easy to dismiss because it offers no spectacle. There were no announcements, no visible markers, No moments others could point to and say, "This is when it changed." And yet, it was changing. Your thinking was shifting. Your priorities were reorganizing themselves quietly. You were learning discernment, what to pursue, what to decline, and what to release without regret. These changes did not draw attention, but they altered everything. They mistook invisibility for absence. But absence is empty, while invisibility can be full beyond measure. Roots grow downward before branches rise upward. Stability is established long before height is achieved. You were strengthening what would later carry weight. They were looking for outcomes, while you were forming capacity, and capacity determines how well success can be held when it finally arrives. Delay also gave you perspective. In the waiting, you saw how easily people confuse speed with significance. You learned how often praise is premature and how quickly it fades. Without the distraction of immediate reward, you were forced to ask harder questions about purpose and direction. You learned whether you were moving for approval or for alignment. That clarity could not have been rushed without being compromised. There were moments when the delay felt personal, even cruel. You wondered whether something had gone wrong, whether effort without recognition was foolish. But even in those moments, something steady kept you moving forward. You continued without certainty, without guarantees, without reassurance. That persistence was shaping a resilience that would later make the difference between temporary success and lasting stability. They never noticed the internal shifts. How you became less reactive, how you stopped chasing validation, how you learned to trust your own judgment. These changes were subtle, but they accumulated. You were becoming someone who could navigate complexity without panic, someone who could hold success without being consumed by it. Delay was not denying you, it was training you to sustain what was coming. What they failed to understand is that visibility often comes last. The moment when growth becomes noticeable is usually the result of many unseen decisions made consistently over time. When change finally surfaced, it looked sudden to them. They called it luck or coincidence. They did not see the years of quiet alignment that made that moment possible. By the time they realized something had shifted, you were already different. Not louder, not boastful, simply steadier. Delay had given you depth, and depth changes the way progress unfolds. You moved with less urgency and more confidence, not because you knew everything, but because you trusted the process that had carried you this far. In the end, delay did not withhold your growth. It concealed it until it was strong enough to stand without explanation. What was forming in the hidden places had matured beyond fragility, and when it finally emerged, it did not ask for permission or validation. It simply existed, rooted, capable, and no longer dependent on being seen to know its own worth. True strength developed quietly, away from applause, rooted in patience and self-mastery. It did not arrive in a single moment of victory or reveal itself through dramatic gestures. It formed slowly in ordinary days that demanded consistency without reward. While others chased recognition, you learned how to stand without it. While they measured progress by attention, you learned to measure it by alignment, by whether your actions matched your values, even when no one was watching. Applause can be intoxicating, but it is also dangerous. It teaches people to perform rather than to become. You were spared that trap. Without constant praise, you were forced to ask deeper questions. Who am I when no one is affirming me? What remains when admiration is removed? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are essential. They strip away the need to impress and replace it with the need to be honest. In that honesty, real strength began to take shape. Patience became your training ground, not passive patience, but the disciplined kind that resists panic and refuses shortcuts. You learned how to delay gratification without losing direction. You learned how to keep going when progress felt invisible. That kind of patience does not weaken ambition, it steadies it. It transforms desire into commitment and hope into endurance. Each time you chose consistency over impulse, something solid formed within you. Self-mastery grew in the absence of external control. With no audience to perform for, you became responsible for your own standards. You learned how to regulate emotion rather than be ruled by it. Anger no longer dictated your behavior. Fear no longer rushed your decisions. Pride no longer needed constant validation. This internal order did not make life easier, but it made you stronger in a way that chaos never could. They did not see this strength because it did not announce itself. It did not interrupt conversations or demand recognition. It showed itself in restraint, in thoughtful responses, in the ability to endure discomfort without becoming cruel. To those who equate strength with dominance, this looked like nothing, but to those who understand depth, it was unmistakable. You were no longer easily provoked, easily swayed, or easily diminished. Without applause, you learned to listen, to your own conscience, to quiet truths, to the difference between what felt urgent and what was actually important. That listening refined your judgment. You became less reactive and more deliberate. Decisions were no longer made to impress or defend, but to align. That alignment brought a quiet confidence that did not fluctuate with opinion. It remained steady regardless of who was watching. This kind of strength does not seek conflict, but it is not afraid of it, because it is rooted, not inflated. It does not need to prove itself because it knows its own weight. When challenged, it does not collapse or explode. It responds. When misunderstood, it does not rush to correct every perception. It trusts time and consistency to speak where words would fail. They were surprised when they could no longer move you the way they once did. The tactics that relied on pressure, ridicule, or urgency stopped working. You were not hardened, but you were grounded. You had learned where your limits were and how to protect them without hostility. That boundary confused them because it did not look like resistance, it looked like certainty. What patience and self-mastery gave you was not visibility, but durability. You could withstand seasons without recognition and moments without clarity. You could remain intact under strain. And when opportunities eventually appeared, you were not destabilized by them. You did not cling or rush or perform. You stepped forward calmly, carrying the weight of someone who had already done the inner work. True strength often looks unimpressive until it is needed. By the time it was visible, it was already formed. No applause had shaped it, and no criticism could undo it. It existed independently of opinion, rooted deeply enough to remain steady long after noise had faded. Arrogance blinded them to the fact that the present moment does not define the final outcome. They looked at where you were and assumed that was where you would remain. They treated circumstances as verdicts, mistaking temporary position for permanent identity. In their minds, the current scene was the whole story, and because it favored them, they felt secure. Arrogance has a way of freezing time like that, convincing people that what is now will always be so. They relied on snapshots instead of understanding movement. They saw one chapter and declared the ending. Your struggles, your pauses, your quiet seasons became evidence in their case against you. They never asked what those moments were shaping, only what they seemed to lack. Arrogance rarely waits long enough to see transformation. It demands immediate proof or dismisses potential entirely. And so they spoke with certainty about things they did not understand. What arrogance fails to grasp is that growth does not ask for permission from the present. It works beneath it, around it, often in contradiction to it. You were not static, even when life looked unchanged. You were adjusting, learning, discarding what no longer served you. The outer picture lagged behind the inner shift, and they mistook that delay for stagnation. They did not realize that the most decisive changes often occur before any visible result appears. Their confidence depended on comparison. As long as they appeared ahead, they felt justified. As long as you appeared behind, they felt affirmed. But comparison is a fragile foundation because it ignores direction. Being ahead means nothing if you are drifting. Being behind means nothing if you are moving with intention. Arrogance cannot tell the difference. It only counts distance, never trajectory. They assumed ease was proof of correctness. If things came easily to them, they believed it meant they deserved it. If things came slowly to you, they believed it meant you were lacking. This illusion is comforting, but it is false. Ease often masks untested weakness, while difficulty builds capacity. You were being strengthened by resistance, not defined by it. They were being softened by comfort, not secured by it. Arrogance also dulled their curiosity. They stopped asking questions. They stopped reflecting. They stopped considering that they might be wrong. Certainty became a shield against self-examination. Meanwhile, uncertainty became your teacher. You were forced to reflect, to adapt, to grow in awareness. Where they settled, you evolved. Where they assumed, you questioned. That difference widened quietly over time. They spoke as if the future belonged to them by default. They planned as though nothing could interrupt their advantage. But the future does not reward arrogance, it exposes it. It tests whether confidence is rooted in character or merely in position. And position changes. Circumstances shift. The ground beneath assumptions moves without warning. What remains is not who was loudest or quickest to judge, but who was prepared to endure change. You understood something they did not. That becoming takes longer than appearing. You accepted seasons that felt small because you sensed they were shaping something larger. You resisted the urge to force outcomes before you were ready to carry them. That restraint protected you from premature success, from being defined too early by roles you had not yet grown into. When the shift finally came, it unsettled them, not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted their certainty. The present they trusted had expired. The conclusions they announced no longer fit the reality unfolding in front of them. And suddenly, they were forced to confront a truth arrogance always avoids, that they had mistaken timing for destiny. You did not need to explain the change. Life did that for you. The moment spoke where arguments never could. What once seemed fixed revealed itself as temporary, and what once seemed delayed revealed itself as deliberate. In that realization, the blindness of arrogance became clear, and the limits of their certainty were exposed, not by your words, but by time itself. Your calm unsettled them more than any argument ever could, because peace exposes false power without confrontation. They were prepared for resistance. They expected anger, defensiveness, explanations, or retaliation. Any of those would have kept the conflict alive and confirmed their influence over you. But calm offered them nothing to push against. It denied them the reaction they relied on to feel dominant, and in that denial, their authority quietly began to unravel. False power feeds on disturbance. It needs emotional noise to prove it exists. When someone reacts, argues, or breaks under pressure, it reassures the one applying pressure that they matter, that they are effective. Your calm disrupted that equation. You did not rise to meet their provocation. You did not collapse under it either. You simply remained steady. And that steadiness created an uncomfortable silence in which their tactics were revealed as ineffective. They mistook calm for indifference at first. They told themselves you did not care, that you were disengaged, that nothing touched you. But calm is not indifference. It is attentiveness without chaos. It is awareness without panic. As time passed, they began to sense the difference. You were present but unreachable, engaged but not entangled. That distinction unsettled them because it suggested you had learned something they had not. Arguments are easy to dismiss. They can be twisted, interrupted, or ignored. Calm cannot. It lingers. It forces reflection. In the presence of someone who is calm, excuses sound hollow. Aggression feels excessive. Manipulation becomes obvious. Your peace acted like a mirror, reflecting back their restlessness, their need for control, their inability to sit comfortably with themselves. And mirrors are threatening to those who avoid self-examination. They tried to provoke you into breaking your composure. They tested boundaries, escalated words, and exaggerated situations, hoping to pull you back into familiar patterns. Each time you remained steady, the imbalance became clearer. The power they thought they held over you depended entirely on your participation. Once you stopped playing your part, the structure collapsed, not loudly but unmistakably. Your calm also changed how others perceived the situation. Without arguments to distract them, people began to notice tone, intent, and behavior more clearly. The contrast between your steadiness and their agitation spoke volumes. You did not have to defend your position. Your presence did that for you. Calm has a way of clarifying truth without explanation. They grew uneasy because calm cannot be rushed or controlled. It does not respond on command. It does not bend to pressure. The more they pushed, the more composed you became, not because you were suppressing emotion, but because you had learned how to contain it. That containment is not weakness. It is mastery, and mastery cannot be taken by force. What unsettled them most was realizing that your calm was not temporary. It was not avoidance or denial. It was rooted. You were no longer governed by their opinions, their approval, or their reactions. You had stepped outside the cycle they depended on, and from outside that cycle, their power looked small. In the end, calm accomplished what arguments never could. It ended the struggle without announcing victory. It revealed strength without aggression. It left no room for escalation and no excuse for blame. They were left facing themselves, stripped of the narrative that cast them as dominant and you as vulnerable. Your peace became the quiet verdict. It said everything without saying anything at all. And in that silence, false power lost its footing, not because it was attacked, but because it was no longer believed in. You did not seek revenge or validation. Moving forward became your response, and that choice altered everything. Revenge would have kept you tied to them, bound to their actions and opinions. Validation would have placed your worth in their hands. You chose neither. Instead, you chose direction. You decided that your energy would no longer be spent correcting people who had already chosen not to see you clearly. That decision did not come from indifference, but from understanding the cost of staying entangled. Revenge is tempting because it promises closure, but it rarely delivers it. It keeps old wounds active and gives past harm a voice in the present. You sense this, even if you could not fully articulate it at the time. You knew that striking back would only echo what had already hurt you, so you refused to let your future be shaped by yesterday's injury. That refusal was not dramatic or loud. It was practical, it was quiet, and it was powerful. Validation carries a similar trap. Wanting to be understood is natural, especially when you have been misrepresented. But you recognized that seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding, you would become a lifelong negotiation. No explanation would ever be enough. No achievement would fully satisfy them. So you stopped presenting your life for their approval. You let go of the need to convince, to clarify, to be seen in a specific way by people who were not willing to see at all. Moving forward required restraint. There were moments when silence felt unfair, when walking away felt like surrender. But it was not surrender. It was redirection. You redirected your attention from what they did to what you could build, from what they thought to what you needed to become. That shift did not erase pain, but it placed pain behind you instead of in front of you. And that placement matters more than people realize. They expected retaliation because retaliation would have kept you predictable. They expected explanations because explanations would have kept you accessible. When neither came, they were left without leverage. You were no longer reacting, you were acting. You were no longer answering, you were moving. That movement did not announce itself, but it carried momentum. Each step forward made the distance between you and them more real. Moving forward also required forgiveness, not the kind that excuses behavior, but the kind that releases control. You did not absolve them of responsibility, you simply stopped allowing their actions to dictate your emotional climate. That release was gradual. It took time, but with each decision to focus on what was ahead rather than what was behind, something loosened. The grip of the past weakened. Your attention returned to the present, where your choices still mattered. What surprised them was not that you moved on, but that you did so without bitterness. Bitterness would have proven they still occupied space in you. Calm progress proved they did not. You did not erase the memory of what happened. You simply refused to relive it daily. You carried the lesson without carrying the weight, and that distinction changed the way you showed up in the world. As you moved forward, your life began to fill with things unrelated to them, new priorities, new understandings, new forms of meaning. Your identity expanded beyond the conflict. You became harder to reduce to a single story. The narrative they held onto no longer fit, because you were no longer standing where they left you. And the farther you moved, the less relevant their version of you became. They noticed the absence before they noticed the progress. You were no longer available for old arguments, old roles, old dynamics. That absence unsettled them because it confirmed something they had avoided admitting. They were no longer central to your life. You had reclaimed that center for yourself, and once reclaimed, it could not be taken back. In choosing forward motion over revenge, direction over validation, you quietly ended the conflict without ceremony. There was no final word, no dramatic turning point, just distance, just growth, just a life unfolding beyond their reach. And in that unfolding, you found something far more satisfying than being proven right. You found freedom. Time revealed the difference between borrowed confidence and earned resilience, and it did so without haste or commentary. At first, the two looked similar. Confidence can imitate strength convincingly when circumstances are favorable. It speaks boldly, moves quickly, and assumes permanence. Resilience, by contrast, is quieter. It does not rush to announce itself. It waits, absorbs pressure, and adapts. In the early moments, few can tell them apart. But time never fails to separate what is merely assumed from what has been built. Borrowed confidence relies on conditions. It thrives when things are going well, when approval is abundant, when outcomes are predictable. It feels solid because it has not yet been tested. Those who carried it mistook ease for ability and speed for mastery. They believed their certainty came from who they were, not realizing how much it depended on what surrounded them. As long as circumstances cooperated, their confidence appeared unshakable. Your resilience, on the other hand, was earned. It was shaped in uncertainty, formed in delay, strengthened under strain. You did not inherit it from praise or borrow it from momentum. You built it slowly, through repeated decisions to continue when stopping would have been easier. Each challenge added a layer. Each setback taught you how to adjust without collapsing. That kind of strength does not look impressive early on because it is still forming. But once formed, it does not disappear when conditions change. Time applied pressure evenly. It altered situations, shifted dynamics, and exposed weaknesses that had been hidden by comfort. When things became uncertain, borrowed confidence faltered. It searched for reassurance, for someone to blame, for something familiar to restore its balance. Without immediate reinforcement, it grew brittle. Certainty turned defensive. Boldness became noise. What once looked strong now appeared fragile. Resilience responded differently. It did not panic when plans changed or when outcomes were delayed. It had already learned how to exist without guarantees. You had practiced patience in moments that offered no reward. You had learned to adjust expectations without losing direction. When time introduced complexity, you were not destabilized by it. You had already made peace with effort that did not pay off immediately. What became clear was not just who succeeded, but who endured. Endurance reveals character more honestly than achievement ever can. Borrowed confidence seeks quick resolution because it cannot tolerate prolonged uncertainty. Earned resilience accepts uncertainty as part of the process. It does not require constant proof to keep moving. It trusts the accumulation of small, consistent actions over dramatic gestures. Time also revealed how people responded to loss. When advantage faded, borrowed confidence shrank. It struggled to redefine itself without comparison, without status, without the familiar signals of success. Resilience, however, was not threatened by loss because it had been forged in it. You knew how to rebuild because you had already learned how to remain intact when things fell apart. The contrast became undeniable. What once looked like dominance now looked dependent. What once seemed slow now looked deliberate. You were no longer measured by where you started, but by how you adapted. While others clung to an image of themselves formed in easier seasons, you continued evolving. Time favored movement over position, growth over assumption. There was no announcement when this difference became visible. It simply emerged. People noticed who could remain steady without reinforcement, who could take responsibility without panic, who could continue without applause. Resilience does not demand recognition. It reveals itself through consistency. Borrowed confidence, by contrast, fades when no one is watching. In the end, time did not reward the loudest or the fastest. It honored what could last. It exposed what was propped up by circumstance and preserved what had been shaped by endurance. And in that quiet reckoning, the truth stood clear. Confidence borrowed from favorable moments eventually expires, but resilience earned through hardship carries forward, intact and undeniable. Their laughter faded when they realized you no longer needed their approval, and that realization unsettled them more than any success ever could. Approval had once been the currency of the relationship. Whether given or withheld, it kept you within reach. As long as you cared how they saw you, they felt relevant. They could influence your mood, your choices, even your sense of worth. What they did not expect was the moment when that currency lost its value. At first, they assumed your independence was temporary, a phase, a reaction. They believed you would eventually return, seeking reassurance or explanation. When you did not, confusion set in. Approval works only when it is desired. The moment you stopped reaching for it, the entire structure collapsed. They were left holding something you no longer needed, unsure what to do with it. Your detachment was not loud or dramatic. You did not announce that you were done seeking validation. You simply stopped adjusting yourself to fit their expectations. You stopped editing your words for their comfort. You stopped measuring your progress against their reactions. This quiet withdrawal was more destabilizing than any confrontation because it removed the power dynamic entirely. They could no longer reward or punish you into alignment. Laughter had once been their shield. It allowed them to dismiss you without engaging seriously. But laughter depends on an audience, and more importantly, on relevance. When you stopped reacting, the laughter lost its purpose. It no longer landed anywhere. It echoed back to them, hollow and unanswered. What once felt effortless now felt forced. They began to sense the shift in subtle ways. Conversations changed. Their comments no longer shaped your direction. Their opinions no longer lingered in your decisions. You listened politely, perhaps, but without urgency. You responded without defensiveness. That calm indifference revealed something uncomfortable. You had outgrown the need to be approved by them. And growth like that cannot be reversed by ridicule. Approval seeking keeps people small because it hands control to external judgment. When you released that need, you reclaimed authority over your own life. You began to act from conviction rather than reaction. That autonomy was not aggressive, it was steady. And steady independence is deeply threatening to those who rely on influence rather than integrity. They noticed that you no longer explained yourself. Explanations had once been your way of asking permission to exist as you were. Without them, you stood on your own terms. That silence was misread at first as distance or arrogance. But underneath, they understood what had happened. You had stopped negotiating your worth. The fading of their laughter marked the moment they realized they were no longer central to your story. They could comment, but not direct. Observe, but not shape. Their role had shifted from participant to bystander. For those accustomed to control, this is a quiet loss. There is no argument to win, no boundary to push back against, just absence. What replaced their laughter was uncertainty. They began to watch more closely, not to support you, but to reassure themselves that they still mattered. But you were no longer performing for them. Your life was no longer a response to their expectations. You were moving according to an internal compass they could not influence. Letting go of approval did not make you cold. It made you free. You were still thoughtful, still kind, still present, but no longer dependent. That distinction is powerful. It allows connection without submission, engagement without compromise. And it exposes the fragility of relationships built on validation rather than respect. In the end, their laughter did not stop because you confronted it. It stopped because it had nowhere left to land. You had removed yourself from the cycle. Without your need for approval, their mockery lost its function, and in that quiet realization, they were forced to face a truth they had avoided. The power they thought they had over you existed only as long as you believed they had it. You got the last laugh not by triumphing over them, but by becoming someone they could no longer diminish. This is the kind of victory that does not announce itself with noise or demand recognition from the very people who once tried to reduce you. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed at first, because it is not about proving anything outwardly. It is about an inner shift so complete that their opinions lose the power to shape you. And when that happens, something irreversible takes place. At one time, their words could reach you. Their judgments could linger. Their dismissal could echo in your thoughts long after the moment passed. Not because they were right, but because you were still measuring yourself against their perception. That was the ground on which they stood. As long as you needed to be understood, validated, or corrected in their eyes, they had a way to make themselves feel larger by making you feel smaller. What changed was not them. What changed was you. Becoming someone they could no longer diminish required shedding old instincts. The instinct to explain, the instinct to defend, the instinct to shrink yourself just enough to avoid conflict or mockery. Those instincts once protected you, but they also limited you. Letting them go felt risky, even uncomfortable, because it meant standing without armor in a familiar battlefield. Yet what you discovered was unexpected. When you stopped lowering yourself, their ability to wound you weakened. You did not rise by humiliating them in return. You did not collect evidence of their failure or wait for a moment to throw it back at them. That kind of triumph is short-lived and keeps the old bond intact. Instead, you rose by becoming more precise about who you were and what you would tolerate. Precision is quiet. It does not argue. It simply moves differently, and difference, when sustained, is undeniable. They tried at times to return you to the old role. A comment here, a reminder there. A subtle attempt to provoke the version of you that once reacted, but that version no longer lived there. You had grown past the reach of those triggers, not because you forgot the past, but because you integrated it. The lessons remained, the wounds no longer dictated your posture. That integration is what made you untouchable. The last laugh was not a sound you made. It was a realization they had. They saw it in how you carried yourself, how you chose your words, how you no longer lingered in spaces that required you to be smaller. They noticed that their presence no longer shifted your center. Their approval no longer elevated you, and their disapproval no longer unsettled you. That awareness crept in slowly, and with it came a quiet understanding. They no longer had access to the parts of you they once controlled. What truly ended their power was your wholeness. You were no longer divided between who you were and who you felt pressured to be. There was no gap for them to exploit, no insecurity to amplify. Wholeness does not respond to ridicule because it no longer needs to protect a fragile image. It exists, and existence, when grounded, is enough. They may never admit it aloud, but they felt it, the shift, the distance, the finality. Not a dramatic ending, but a closing of a door that would not reopen. You did not disappear from their world, you simply stopped orbiting it. Your life expanded beyond the narrow frame they once used to define you. And in that expansion, their voices grew smaller until they became background noise rather than authority. The last laugh belongs to the one who outgrows the need to laugh back. It belongs to the one who no longer needs witnesses to confirm their worth. You did not win by defeating them. You won by becoming unreachable to their judgment. And that kind of victory does not fade, because it is not dependent on circumstances or opinion. In the end, the story resolved itself without drama. You stood where you were, fully yourself, no longer adjustable to someone else's expectations. They were left with their assumptions, outdated and ineffective. You moved forward with a quiet certainty they could not imitate. And in that contrast, in that irreversible becoming, the truth was settled. You were never meant to be diminished. And the last laugh was never about sound at all, but about freedom. And so the story closes, not with noise, but with clarity. What began as dismissal ends as understanding, not theirs, but yours. You understand now that the laughter you once feared was never a verdict on your worth. It was only a reflection of their limits, their impatience, their need to feel superior in a moment that could not last. What endured was not their judgment, but your becoming. You did not arrive here by accident. Every season of silence, every misunderstood choice, every stretch of waiting shaped something solid within you. You learned what could not be taught quickly, how to stand without applause, how to move without permission, how to remain whole when others tried to reduce you to a version that made them comfortable. You discovered that strength does not announce itself and that peace does not need witnesses to be real. What makes this ending decisive is not that they see you differently, but that you no longer need them to. Their laughter lost its meaning the moment you stopped measuring yourself against it. Their opinions lost their weight when you stopped carrying them. You did not silence them. You outgrew the space where their voices mattered. That is the quiet victory few recognize until it has already happened. There is a rare freedom in realizing that the final word does not belong to those who spoke the loudest at the beginning. It belongs to the one who endured, who refined pain into wisdom, who turned delay into preparation, who chose forward movement over resentment. The last laugh was never about reversal or revenge. It was about resolution. You stand now with a steadiness that cannot be borrowed or taken away. What you carry was earned slowly, honestly, and deeply. No circumstance can easily undo it. No opinion can redefine it. You are no longer reacting to a past that tried to confine you. You are acting from a center that knows itself. And that is where the story truly ends. Not with triumph over others, but with mastery of self. Not with vindication, but with peace. Not with a sound, but with a life that speaks for itself.